Hey, I'm Andy Birkey. I am a maker and I have a small shop in Bloomington, Illinois. And I recently had a really cool opportunity to have a research psychologist, Dr. David Patterson, with me here in the shop. And he agreed very generously to sit down and discuss the maker mindset with me and to put it all on video so that we could put it out there to the maker community and hopefully be of some benefit and some use to everybody. I just can't say thank you enough to Dr. Patterson. I'd like to thank a lot of people in the maker community online that I reached out to for questions and input on what to talk to the doc about. And I would also like to thank Chris Cute from Make the First Cut for his help in editing this down a little bit. So without much further ado, I'm going to just go right into it. If this is a benefit for you, please share it throughout the community, and maybe it can be a benefit for everybody. So all the best. Thank you for watching. So today we've got Dr. David Patterson with us. Doc, tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from.
So right now I'm a professor at University of Washington School of Medicine, and a large part of my career has been working at a trauma hospital, and particularly in a bird unit was my early work. And when I was trying to work with really acute pain, I had to come up with something that worked quickly, and one of the things that really worked was hypnosis, surprisingly. And there's a whole lot of science to hypnosis now, but the learning about hypnosis led me to think about how the brain works and how we can really get people in hypnotic states. And I think that the creative maker world, people are in quasi-hypnotic states, or there's a lot going on with the brain that happens in hypnosis and deep meditation. So I've always had that interest. And then you and I have had a friendship that's been going on for over 30 years, and I've watched your career with fascination go through a lot of different areas, and you know, over the past decade, culminating in doing fine woodwork and really renovations for types of things that no one else would touch. And then what I've seen is you become part of this community that is extraordinary, right, all over the world, and people that are basically creators of one nature or another, but getting into this type of synergistic relationship, mm-hmm, where you're feeding off each other's skills and knowledge, but also the creativity, and it's really fascinating to watch you're like a big worldwide brain with the neurons firing and the synergy happening. And so I kind of watched this with fascination, not having those skills myself, but just when you had the idea of us talking about some of the psychology behind what you're doing, I really jumped at it.
Excellent. Well, let's get into it.
Yeah.
As I've been preparing for this, I've talked to a lot of people in the community and kind of was looking for input from them, really using what we refer to as the hive mind. And so brain function, it came up over and over in my preparation. Specifically, brain function, how does it apply to what we do, how we create, and the need that it fills for us?
My third disclaimer is that I'm not necessarily an expert in the brain. It's part of my work as a psychologist, but I forced myself to learn a lot more. And I think I've become good at simplifying it because I've had to do that for myself. But there's a couple of ways to look at what happens with the brain. One of the ways is to look at what areas are firing as you're solving a problem or you're doing something. There's different areas of the brain that are functioning. There's been a famous saying that we only use 5% of our brain. It's very often not a matter that we're not using more of our brain. It's that at one time only 5 to 25% of it might be firing, and that tends to be localized to certain areas. And so people have learned a lot by looking at the areas that are working. So they've learned a lot by looking at the areas of the brain that are working, and then figured out what's happening with why the way the processing is working based on that. So that is called localization. So you're looking at which area of the brain is lighting up. The other area is basically has to do with electrical waves in the brain, usually studied by EEGs. And so we have a lot of electrical processing going in our mind, and it's basically the way nerves are turning on and turning off, and they go in patterns. And so there's an alpha state and beta state, and other states that are more connected with relaxation and really focused minds. And so the other way to look at the brain besides localization is basically brainwave activity. And so rather than looking at the particular area of our brains, we're looking at the electrical activity and what it seems to reflect.
So is that where we come up with the right brain, left brain sort of delineation in layman's terms?
Yes, and that's a critical one. It might be more critical to our discussion than anything else I'm talking about. You know, we have basically two halves of our brain, and the real simple way is to say that there's a left brain and a right brain. That's kind of a gross generalization, because if you're right-handed or left-handed and so on, it switches, and it's not really exact, but it's a really good way to understand it. And a better way to put it is that there's a logical part of the brain that's kind of tied to language, and then there's a very visual, spatial, non-logical part, and both are functioning at once. Probably the most central message to this community is very often, I believe what all of you are doing when you're really involved with your craft is escaping left brain thinking activity. And yes.
So problem solving versus the real creative design part of it. Are both of those functioning at the same time, or are they competing back and forth?
There's a certain amount of competition. There's a large area of the brain, or some large neurons called the corpus callosum, and they basically connect the two hemispheres. So there is communication going back and forth. What I will say is that the logical or left part of the brain looks at the world sequentially. If you're looking at a sports announcer doing an overhead for Andy Birkey's life, you go, okay, now Andy's going in the wood shop and he's looking around, he's wondering which tools he's going to use, he's thinking about what he might do for lunch today, and so it's this really annoying voice of Marv Albert going on and doing an overhead in your voice. And most of us, particularly in Western society, can't function that way. We need the left brain to get to work and so on. And so it really serves a lot of useful purposes, particularly in hard sciences. And so it's definitely not something to dismiss. Mm-hmm. The thinking that comes out of the left brain, however, is very often the source of our angst in society.
Right.
And Shakespeare put it really well. He said, "Nothing is neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so." And so when we start putting things into dichotomous thoughts, we basically look at life in a different way, and it's compartmentalized. And we think that that's the answer, and that's what reality is, but it's actually a step away from reality. So even though we really need this processing, it's very often throws us off.
Gotcha. You know, a lot of people in the community, and myself included, kind of feel like we are the different children. You know, if you look at society as a whole, are we that different as creatives and as thinkers and makers, or is it just something that we are applying more? Are we basically wired the same, or as creators are we wired differently than most people?
Well, I think you're wired differently than most people. There's definitely right brain people. And when people are more right brain, they tend to be less organized, less compulsive, less adherent to time, and things like that. And instead they tend to think much more in creative terms. They're more kinesthetic, they're more visual spatial. But one of the things that we'll talk about is very few of these things are dichotomous. It's not like we're makers or non-makers and so on. It's like we're all capable of both things. But I would say that your community as makers lean much more to the right brain and that way of processing things.
Mm-hmm. So where exactly does creativity come from then?
Okay, so you ask where creativity comes from, and my immediate reaction is it comes from nothing or nothingness. And so creativity is really when we're not adhered to a particular thought and we're out of our thinking brain and we're really in that void of nothingness. And our brain states reflect that. We're in much more in theta type of brain states, and so it comes from nothingness. And so getting to that point, one of the most important thing for your community is getting to that point where all your preconceived notions are out of the way, and you're really just letting yourself go to a different brain state, and pretty much in Zen terms, I call that nothingness.
So basically, that point where the guy's going to light a firework, but he has to concentrate on getting to stillness to light the fuse.
Yes.
It's kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms. And interesting, one of the ways you get there is very focused attention. The other way is, I think often in your community, is by just losing yourself in your work. Mm-hmm. And when you get in that state, there's a lot more creativity happening.
Well, you brought up, focus, and I guess in our community, there appears to be maybe a higher occurrence of hyperfocus and ADD and ADHD, and is that something that is that something that is real, or are we sort of putting that on our own community?
Well, one of your community members posed the question, what's the relationship with ADD and the type of work that you're doing, and why does it seem that you can be ADD and when you're involved with your work that all goes away? And I thought that was a wonderful question. And one of the things about attention deficit disorder is that one of the key components is distraction. People with ADD are very often plagued by distraction. So I'll try a joke with you. How many people with ADD does it take to change a light bulb?
I have no idea. Squirrel! Exactly.
Yeah, so, and basically what happens is that when you folks get lost in your project, when you're making, and when that part of the brain turns off, your capacity to be distracted turns off too. So you all of a sudden can maintain attention for long periods of time, but the main thing is that you're not being distracted by all the things that would usually distract you.
All the white noise.
Yes.
You have something to focus on. Is that what they call hyperfocus?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a term that I've heard thrown around, but I'm not sure exactly what.
Yeah, it's one, and every once in a while, there's a term hyperfocus, and I'm sure that's part of it. It's just that in my nomenclature, I just can't recognize terms. So
in our community, there's not only the making part of it, but there's also content creation, which is we're either making films such as this one, or we're watching those. If you're looking at the brain and a creative is watching somebody else make something, is the same things firing as if the person was actually making something themselves?
No, it's definitely a step removed, isn't it? Because when you're watching someone make something, you're going through certain brain pathways, and then it registers in one place. And on the other hand, when you're actually making something, it's different parts of the brain are functioning. Now, I can't say exactly it's which, but one of the big things as I was reviewing the questions, one of the huge things about makers is the kinesthetics. And we really overlook the importance of kinesthetics in our society, and particularly how some people are really kinesthetically oriented. You and I have a friend from Canada named Max, and he is very kinesthetically oriented, and he's aware of that. He has to be doing things with his hands and making things. And a lot of people are like that. That's the way they relate to the world. And people who relate to the world through visual input, thinking, auditory input, sometimes don't realize, first of all, that some people are really kinesthetically oriented, and second of all, that for a lot of us, kinesthetics is an important way to relate to the world. So one of the really important points, I think, for your community is kinesthetics, and that really explains a lot of the satisfaction that you have, and that comes out of this.
I get it. So we talk a lot about being willing to be a newbie, to be not good at making something. For me, having been a long time around wood, if I get a piece of metal in my hand, I am instantly, a newbie, or, an apprentice, as it were. Is there firings in the brain that when you transfer and get that sort of almost adrenaline rush from not knowing what you're doing physically, is that something that is a different charge in the brain that you kind of get almost a fight or flight type of reaction to it?
Well, there's a couple of questions there, and I think one of the questions, and maybe the first one I'll address, is just being willing. It seems that your community seems to be, partly because of the nature of the community, you're willing to say that you don't have the answers more. And the ability to say I don't know is one of the biggest gateways to learning. I forgot the saying, but if you're learning from someone who has all the answers, thinks that they have all the answers, you're going down the wrong path, because no one has all the right answers. So very often it's the person that asks the right questions rather than knows the answer that you'll be learning from. But the whole issue of being comfortable with acknowledging that you don't know the answer and seeking it out is, I think, incredibly important to the work that you do. And for a lot of left brain people, it's very difficult to admit that they don't know. And one of my biggest examples is I have an appointment to a surgery department. And I can't do surgery. I wouldn't be good at it, but I don't have an MD. But one of the ways that surgeons are trained is they always have to have the answer. And as a matter of fact, in their training classes, they start off with a large class, and very often it's very competitive and gets whittled down. And so very often their approach to the world is that I have to know all the answers. And that really serves a surgeon. You have someone who's cut you open and is messing around your...
They better know what they're doing.
Yeah. So, so that works in some areas for us. But I noticed in graduate school I was against an extremely competitive group of students that were much smarter than me. And we go to the classes were on curves, and I tried to make A's, but they were just always way out of my league. And it was at that point I said, I became comfortable with the notion of just saying no. I don't know the answer. And that was incredibly freeing for me, because I was no longer driven by having to know the answer. Now, as far as the work that you're doing, what I learned last night about the hive mind is that there's a lot of safety in your community about
Definitely.
acknowledging it.
Definitely.
And like for you, you have an expertise in restoring ancient woodwork and things that most people can't do, and people turn to you. But what you're willing to do now is like, you don't know how a 3D printer might translate into your work, and so you're willing to go out into the community and say, look, I really don't know where to start here. And then my understanding is that part of your community will break apart and say, okay, I can do this, and I'd love to talk about it, so let's set this time aside. And I think that's just a wonderful part of this whole process. And I think one of the things about turning this into a worldwide community and the discussion is that people are modeling not knowing the answer and letting other ones know that it's okay not to know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so more and more people are freeing themselves from the shackles of having to know the answer. And when that happens, that opens up all kinds of doors, as well as creativity.
Does that happen chemically in the brain, or are you talking more of a personality sort of opening up?
Yeah, in the way I'm putting it now, and the way you can put all of this is you can put it in neurological terms and social terms and learning, and so there's so many little theories. Every theory is a range of convenience. But what I'm talking now is a type of socialization that in Western society in particular, we're socialized to where we have to know the answer,
Right.
and we beat ourselves up when we don't know the answer. And very often people go through life that way. But unfortunately, they lose out on so much because they're not opening themselves up to things that they don't know.
Well, that brings it to a good point that I've been curious about is typically we're talking about people in the creative maker community that spend a lot of their time being the loner or being really not understood. What we're finding now is that we can relate to people in the community. And I guess I'm curious how is it that people who are typically and historically loners and free thinkers can be enveloped into a very socialized community?
Well, yeah, and so how can independent loners be socialized in this community? And when you look at it, it's somewhat of a paradox, isn't it?
Right,
you
right.
have people that are on their own, and all of a sudden are forming a community. So I'll get back to the community in a moment, but the people that are, a lot of the people that are makers and are very creative do go to the beat of a different drum. And when they do that, they often, they either by choice or by nature, they don't go with the mainstream. And they just don't feel very often like they fit in, and they
Right.
don't, because they're almost by definition, an independent thinker isn't a conformist.
Right.
And so that leads very often to a certain amount of isolation. And but I should say, as a parallel concept, introversion is increasingly understood as an underlooked value in our society. Introverts aren't gregarious, they're not as well socially skilled, but it's known now that they're deeper thinkers. And they really take a problem and they go much deeper. They say less, but they go into a lot more depth. So basically what you're talking about, again, is a group of somewhat independent thinkers that can almost in some ways be outside of mainstream society. And now all of a sudden you have this community where these people kind of on the fringe of normal thinking are getting together and supporting themselves. And I think it's a fascinating but just a wonderful type of paradoxical joining that's going on.
So I guess one of the things that's interesting to me is there a fundamental or physiological difference between those people who create three-dimensional projects or things versus people who just consume? Just if they have a desire for something, they go buy it. Is that a sociological thing, or is there a fundamental difference?
Yeah, and so that was one of the questions that came up from one of your members, is the difference between consuming and creating. And so one of the things I'll go back to with this question and some of the others is it's not dichotomous. We're all both creators and consumers. What's apparent with your community is that you lean much more towards the creative side,
right,
in creating. And I think one thing that I can say about consuming in general is that consuming is really a form of insecurity and a way to calm yourself by eating more or buying more. So kind of compulsive, well, not, shopping that goes to the extreme, or eating to, a lot of that is, can go back to childhood and so on, and it's a way of self-soothing, okay? So I would say one of the characteristics that really happens with more creative people that are making things is that they are more secure with themselves, and they're not so wrapped up in these, in feeling better about themselves and going outward to do that they're able to go within and create.
Well, that's the upside. So the downside a lot of times is, like for me, I know that it feels like I can never turn it off. That it's almost like a buzzing in the back of my head. That how does one calm that down and be able to focus on creating again?
Yes, and we've talked about that a lot, just the notion of, to a certain degree, when your group is doing what they do best, they're in a flow state, which are very absorbed in their activity, and just not attending to other things. And one of the things that we've talked about is that if you're in that flow state for too long, it becomes self-defeating at some point.
Right.
And for that matter, if you're in any brain state for too long, it just, you get fatigued, and then you have to switch to something else. So as you said, there are some downsides to it, and I imagine what really happens to a lot of you folks is that you really get focused on a problem, and then you can't let it go, and then you're up at 2 a.m., I got to solve that problem, or,
right,
or I have a new, and so there is, it's like everything, there's a balance to life, and you, at a certain point, you have to recognize if you're going too far in one direction.
Mm-hmm. You've heard me use the phrase "see more, make better." What's your take on the need to sort of refill the reservoir, if it were, of creative juices by seeing new things and inspiring things? Is that something that is foundationally right?
Well, same whether, the see more, make more, and kind of that mentality is essentially right, it's not the right way to phrase the question, because it's neither right nor wrong. But I think it again goes to the notion of balance. I do think that the notion of see more, make more is really critical, and it goes back to what we were talking about, is being willing not to know the answers, and then opening yourself up to new information. And a lot of people that are pretty smart and advanced, fall into this trap of thinking that they know all the answers. Mm-hmm. And so they're not willing to really look and to see other things. And it's at that point, when you're allowing yourself to do that you're able to bring in a lot more angles and a lot more information. And people that are able to do that are gifted. But at the same time, like we're talking earlier, is if you do that all the time, if you do that too much, it's kind of the detriment of knowing that you need to eat lunch.
Mm-hmm. So balance really is a foundational thing that we need to keep in mind.
Yes.
So ideas, I guess, where do ideas, creative spark, where does that come from? Both from a, neurological, what happens in the brain when there is that moment. Where, I guess the ultimate question that I'm really trying to ask is, how do we do that? How can we feed that How can we get more fresh, unique ideas?
Well, first of all, I think the maker community is somewhat more headed in that direction more than normal. And so there's the, and I can't really put it in neurological terms, but there's this notion of how do we get back to that creative state. And it's very individual, and usually I think that's a really good question to turn back to the community, because you were pointing out when you're working with flow states with Olympians, as a couple of good trainers have done, they ask Olympians what they do to get back in the flow state, and they all kind of have different answers. I think always one thing is that if you're getting stopped or you're getting bulked up, then your brain is probably telling you that you're wearing out these neurons for now. And so one of the best things is to get completely away from the activity and do something else. Do exercise, do something physical, something completely away from it. Because if you stay in the same task and you're feeling like you're losing your charge and your creativity, banging your head against the wall isn't going to work. A good friend told me about was looking at a woodpecker and out his window and just noticing that. Think about what this woodpecker is doing. He's getting up in the morning, going to his job, and he's pounding his head into the very hard wood over and over again. And it works. But sometimes a woodpecker just has to go and have a beer. Right?
Exactly. Well, I guess the flip side of that is, why can't a creative, a lot of times when they come up against a problem, it's very, very difficult to let go of that.
Yeah.
Until it's solved. How does one attack that issue?
Well, first of all, it's one of the questions from your community is like, why do our brains keep working as a problem? And that's known in current psychological literature as the incubation effect. That it's well known that if we're posed with a problem, our attention will be fixed on it, and then our attention will be shifted somewhere else. But the brain tends to stick with that problem. And,
right.
And it's not the left brain. It's more the creative part of the brain keeps working on it, and so very often the answer pops out hours later, days later, months later, and but for whatever reason, the human mind is programmed to keep trying to solve that problem, and it's a real gift that we have. And I think one of the things that we can do to take advantage of it is just to trust ourselves and realize that if we're pointing our intention in a certain way, that we're going to get a certain project done, even if we're failing for the moment. If we have that intention, very often the answer is going to come with us, come back to us the way we're wired.
So some creative minds, and mine is probably one of them, there gets to be this cacophony of almost like voices that, that's hard to control. And how is it possible to get those things to quiet down so that we're able to focus?
Well, I think, talking about when your mind is very creative, you very often go to even dark places and very distracting places. And first of all, almost by definition, that's a part of creativity, because you're really not monitoring what's going on. And we talk about, in psychoanalytic theory, we talk about an archaic part of the processing where it's more just very basic instincts and colors and so on. And part of when you're being creative, part of what you're doing is accessing that. You're also, when you're not in thought, and you're freeing yourself from thought, everything's illogical, right? Almost by definition. Being in the moment is not logical, and we fight it. Our logical part of our brains constantly fight being in the moment and being here right now, because it's a threat to rational thinking. But at the same time, it's like when we get out there and when we're in our really creative sides and places in our mind, it's very often a very strange territory. And a lot of weird stuff comes up. And to a certain degree, one of the things that you have to be careful as a very creative, artistic person is not trying to talk about all of that to, the left-brain people, because you're going to sound pretty weird sometimes, because it is by definition irrational. And so if you're trying to explain it or talk about it to a rational mind, and so that's kind of where you have to kind of self-monitor yourself and saying, okay, I'm way out there now, but I'm acknowledging it, but when I'm explaining it to people, I kind of have to rein myself in.
Is the fact that you're aware of that dark places and the dark stuff that's going along with this, is it that if you're aware of that in the moment, then you're okay? Or is it?
Yeah, well, being aware of our dark side, and first of all, a lot of people don't like to acknowledge it, but we all have a very dark side. And in Nazi Germany, it was really tempting for the rest of the world to look at Germany and saying these were evil people. But there's a famous Russian writer that talks about the concept that goodness and evil are within all of us. And anyone who thinks that there's sheer goodness and they have no evil in them is full of shit, or is full of it, we could say. So part of it, but one of the steps to even become more creative and so on is to acknowledge that dark side of ourselves and not try to make it go away, but to be friends with it. And if you befriend that, some of the dark stuff that comes up and acknowledge it, it basically frees you up to be a more full person. But when you try to suppress that part of you and say, no, that's not me, or I'm going to try to get rid of it, rather than befriend it, you're kind of stifling yourself in life.
I have a question from the community that I'd like to, I'm just going to read it verbatim because it was so well put.
Yes.
By a non-English speaker, by the way.
Oh, I think I remember that one.
I think it's fascinating, and I'd like to get your take on it, but I'm going to cheat here and read it straight up. People get into the maker world and they very quickly start to identify themselves as makers, even if their main job is something completely different. We love that. It's like a secret superhero side of people that once they discover it, it changes their whole perspective on everything. Why is the maker lifestyle something that we can all agree on and something that we let into our self-perception so fast? I've had so many jobs and so many hobbies. I've never called myself a DJ, designer, case maker, bartender, display artist, but I've always wanted to call myself a maker. I think that is interesting. Does this make us feel comfortable to know that we would be able to help ourselves and others with those basic caveman skills that most people have lost?
Yeah, and needless to say, there's a lot to that question.
It's loaded a little bit.
Yeah. But one of the things that you and I were talking about is that what you're doing is not a hobby. It's something much deeper than that, and really, it's become part of your identity. But almost by definition, it's a paradox. It's really hard. It's almost hard to describe what's going on with all of you because it really kind of defies definition, and creativity and in the moment processing and really being lost in the flow isn't something you can put into words. Now, one of the reasons that I like the way the question is worded is that one of the answers was given at the end, caveman mentality. A lot of what's driving your community is evolutionary based, and when we started off in all this thousands of years ago, we were programmed to fix things and to survive. And they're very off. There really is a survival mechanism in all this, and it has served us in evolutionary terms. And now we're lost in this internet world, brief attention span, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are finding refuge in going back to their basic evolution. Another one of your writers talked about the notion of leaving a legacy.
Yes.
And it was another beautiful point because it's really somewhat existentially based. I think it serves us to be very aware of our own mortality and the notion of leaving a legacy. And so yes, at some point that might drive us to make things and so on, but it also hits at a very basic level when we acknowledge that we're not going to live forever. It really is a thing that helps us hone in on what's important, and this is something that's very important. It's leaving a legacy, but it's also living fully and really enjoying a moment. And I think that's very often what all of you get lost in a very pleasant way.
Yeah, you kind of get both sides of it. I mean, especially those of us who are content creators. You know, there is a special joy of getting that also made, and the concept of the process, or the process becoming the project, you know, the actual product. And I think that's a great point, that we get both ends of that. For the content creators, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up something that I was very curious to get your take on. Is in the outline part of our community is very supportive, but as you put yourself out, especially on the internet, there is a phenomenon called trolling, and quite frankly, it is mystifying to a lot of us, the motivation behind trolls, what they get from, very narcissistic and self-serving comments. But I really want to get your take on that and see what you think, what that's all about.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions that I thought most about is, what's going on with the trolling behavior and so on. And one of my first reactions to that is, again, not to think too much in terms of dichotomy, and also that we all have these features within us.
Right.
We all have been trolls in our life in certain things, now, in certain aspects. Much like bullying. We've been bullied and we've been the bullier, however you would say. But as far as, having said that, I think that there are a lot of phenomena that go on with this type of behavior on the internet. For one thing, it's very safe to attack another, and it might be that a lot of these folks really have had trouble expressing themselves and have been beaten down to a certain degree, and this is an opportunity to really act on some of their anger without consequences. And at one level, they're very often not seeing that they're doing that. But another thing is just basic insecurity, that when you feel threatened and so on, you kind of react with these type of behaviors, and they're really exaggerated. Another thing I would point out that is occurring more and more in our societies, that we're becoming so attached to texting and the electronic world that we are becoming a nation or multi-nation of people who have more autistic-like, Asperger-like syndromes. And when I say autistic or Asperger, that means a disconnection from emotional responding to people.
So they're not understanding that the person who created the content, who's reading it, is a real human.
Yes,
really,
and that's a wonderful way to put it. But they're kind of one step removed, and they don't see that.
So we take it as a personal attack. I mean, you have to. But that's not the intent. The intent is more selfish and more just lashing out.
Yeah, but that's one of the things, is that we can't really see what the intent is. It could be any number of things, and it could be that this person just isn't really capable of emotional connection.
Gotcha.
And but it could be any number of things. But it's pretty much like, it's like anything running into someone in life that just really sets us off and makes us feel judgmental. Whenever you see this type of behavior, there's usually a type of insecurity that is underneath it. And if you really conversely put yourself in these people's shoes, you would realize that, they've probably been pretty beaten down to get to the point where they have to do this, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the best reaction?
No reaction.
Really?
Yeah.
You didn't hesitate, because this comes up quite a bit.
Yeah.
I just want to put this dude in his place. But in your opinion, the best reaction is none.
Yeah. People often think that ignoring is doing nothing. Ignoring is actually one of probably the most powerful ways to change behavior. If you ever had a girlfriend or a boyfriend that just started ignoring you, you remember how powerful it is. But now I do understand, I have had a lot of experiences with watching listservs and communities develop, and I do believe that it's important to have a good monitor in the background. And so I think if you let this behavior go, unleashed, it can really become a problem, and it can really be destructive to the community.
Right.
And so I don't know, kind of in your world, if you have someone that quietly monitors this, and if someone does this, just writes them independently and says, hey, this isn't okay, which is the best way I think that I can handle it, that I would handle it. I think when people kind of get into a pissing match or a back and forth with the person that's trolling, then it just kind of, it partly serves their purpose.
Right.
And
they feed on it.
And a lot of people, just as another example, a lot of people are structured by seeking out conflict as a way of expressing themselves. They don't feel alive unless they're in conflict. And so
they need it.
They need it. Right. And so that will express itself in your community as well. And so it is really great if there's someone in the background that's kind of monitoring this and just quietly saying, hey, this isn't okay.
Right.
And
or we have to self-monitor.
Yeah. And one of the best self-monitoring stuff is just
nothing.
No response.
Gotcha. So Doc, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you coming by, taking the time to set all this up. Doc got these questions about 2 weeks ago and has been consulting with colleagues and putting work into this for the community. And I think I can grab everybody by the virtual shoulder and say thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's an amazing opportunity for us as lay people to be able to get inside your head and let you get inside ours.
Yes.
Thanks, man.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us. Dr. David Patterson.